I know Joe has got a lot of material to get through today. Hopefully you enjoyed last week's session with our representatives from Orange County and Legacy Vacations and the Resilience Committee. I thought they did a great start. So the idea of last week was to set the scene with sustainability and resilience to get the sort of heavy side of the context that you're going into. This week, it's creative, and future thinking, okay? Joe Tankersley is a very good friend, a good colleague. Joe has many years of Disney Imagineering experience. So he joined Disney, I think, Joe, you said in 1996. So long time ago, but 20 years of experience traveling around the world, thinking futuristic ideas for Disney. So I don't need to say anything more apart from Joe will be very interesting. And what we're trying to do, get you to think as creatively and as future thinking as possible for when you complete your videos. So without any further ado, Joe, thank you very much for your time, all the way from Sanford. Joe, the floor is yours, and I'm intrigued how I need to think to be a futurist. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks a lot, Alan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Although I have to correct you, it's Winter Springs, not Sanford. You know, we're much hipper, and we're actually only 5 miles away from the UCF campus. So, anyway, so I'm going to just dive in here today and share my screen, and we'll see what we can learn in the next 45 minutes about how to think like a futurist. Okay, everybody good with that? Hopefully, you're seeing a slide there. Perfect. So very first off the bat, I want to thank Alan and everyone involved in this project with the opportunity to be a part of it, because I think it's really exciting. I also think it's incredibly important, because the more people that we have involved in thinking about the future of Central Florida, the better future that we're likely to create. And in the past, these kinds of open source imagining of the future has not been standard. Typically what happens is a governmental organization goes off, comes up with a big plan, and then unveils it and tries to sell it to the public. Having all of you have input into this, young, creative people who are, in the most part, starting out in your careers, I think is going to make a much better vision for the future. So what I want to do today is we wonder whether or not the slides will advance. That's always the exciting part. Here we go. So I'm going to take about 45 minutes, and I'm going to try to explain to you a set of tools that you can use for this project that will make you better futurists, that will make it possible for you to think, imagine, and create like futurists actually do. Whoops. And so this is what we're going to talk about. The very first thing is I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the future, because it's particularly relevant, I think, in terms of Orlando's story and the story you're thinking about in terms of the future. So we'll do a little bit of that. I'll tell you what futurists really do, to try to describe a little bit about how we operate in the work. Then we're going to dive into the actual work that might be useful content for you as you begin to do your project. We're going to talk about how you look for clues about the future. Where do you find them? And then the next thing is what do you do with them? How do you turn those clues into something that will be useful to you as you begin to explore the possibilities? And I'll end it with a few examples from some other projects that we've done about the future of tourism that hopefully will just be the kind of sort of mind expanding ideas that will help you think big and broad as you move into the future. So hopefully that all makes sense. I will try to cover this in an economically way. So we'll have some time at the end for some conversation. First of all, thinking about the future is not new. We have always been fascinated by the future. You go back into medieval, history, throughout history, the future's been an interesting thing. But for people in this country particularly, the future became our obsession after the Second World War, around 1950. And a lot of that had to do with the burst of technology that was going on then, and the fact that the country is growing and we were growing economically and lots of things were changing. And we really became interested in telling news stories about the future. And that's gone on now for a long time, and we're still very, I think, obsessed with the future. What that means, though, in its relationship to Orlando, I think is kind of interesting and unique. I came to Orlando in 1982. Well, I actually have one of these tickets somewhere. I don't know if any of you have ever seen them before. 1982 was the grand opening of Epcot, officially known as the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. All of the literature at the time, the marketing material that came out of Disney at that time said the 21st century begins on October 1st, 1982. And that was what Epcot was intended to be. It was intended to give us a series of creative visions of what the future might look like. And most of you are probably way too young to have been there in 82, but you might have had a chance to see Epcot before it became the universe of superheroes that it is today. But in its original concept, it was to show us what the future of transportation might look like, what the future of living in space might look like, agriculture, living underwater. And they had actually brought together the leading futurists of the time to help the Disney Imagineers create that image. And so we've got a core relationship here in Orlando to thinking about telling stories about the future. But that relationship and the Disney company actually goes back even further. Epcot was based on an idea that Walt came up with in the late 1950s, early 60s, called Progress City. And Walt's idea was not to build another theme park after he had built Disneyland. Walt wanted to build a city, a real living, working, breathing city, a place where innovation would constantly be going on, where experimentation would be the order of day. He wanted to experiment with new forms of education, with new forms of transportation, with all sorts of different ways to live. And that's because Walt understood something very important. That creating the future is not a static activity. It is something you're constantly doing. You're constantly trying to evolve it as you go through. And some of what I'm going to talk about today is how we as futurists try to make sure that we do that. But that wasn't Walt's first endeavor to think about this future, in fact. When he opened Disneyland, one of his primary lands, as all of us know, was Tomorrowland, the place where we could venture into those great, big, beautiful tomorrows, whether it was to, travel into outer space, to imagine what it might be to live under the sea. Those were big technological issues back in the 1950s that everybody was fascinated by. And so we see this thread as we go back through Walt's history, that he was always primarily interested in not just nostalgia, which so many people think about this Disney, but also about the future and what it might mean. I'm going to take you back one more step into the past. And before Disneyland even opened, Walt had a television program called Disneyland. Its main purpose was to promote the idea that he was building a theme park. But one of the main segments was called Tomorrowland. And about once a month, they would do a show on some future aspect. And Walt called these science factuals. They weren't science fiction stories. They were stories about what could be possible. And their purpose was to inspire people to think about creating great, big, beautiful tomorrows at the time. The idea of inspiring people to think about ways to create the future. And so I think that thread is really important for us to understand. It's certainly been very important for me and how I got here. And I'll tell you a little bit about my progress and how I became a futurist. As Alan said, I started working at Walt Disney Imagineering in 1996. At the time, I was a filmmaker and a writer, a storyteller. Didn't really know that much about Walt's history. But I started working on a project called One Man's Dream around 2000. And that's where I began to see all of these different bits where Walt had been so fascinated about the future and fascinated by the ability of stories to create the future. And one of the quotes that really stuck with me came from Ray Bradbury, who was a famous science fiction writer and also one of the people who helped design Epcot. He described Walt as the optimistic futurist. And when I saw that, I was like, that's it. That's what I want to be. I want to grow up to be an optimistic futurist. But of course, the question was, what does that even mean? And what's the relationship and what can a storyteller do to think about the future in different ways? And so that leads me to what it means to be a futurist and what futurists actually do. After learning about Walt's history, thinking about the future, I dove deep into the idea of foresight and futures, learned that it was indeed a whole area that you could study, that there were people in the world doing this kind of work, and that it had been around for about 50 or 60 years. And since then, as I tell people I'm a futurist, there are two questions they always get asked. The first one is not the one you see on the screen. The first one is that really a job? And usually that's my mother who wants to know that. But the truth is that there are futurists working in universities, there are futurists working in corporations and in governments, and they've been responsible for a lot of the most important, far-reaching thinking that's going on in the world. And so, yes, there are people who are futurists, and there are also futurists in the area of hospitality and tourism, although less so, if any of you are interested in claiming that territory. The second question, though, and the one everybody really wants to know is, do you have a crystal ball? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is no, because my job is not to predict the future. Foresight is not about predicting the future. Foresight is about how we can think differently about the future in order to build a better future and build the future that all of us actually want to be a part of in the future. That's the real key. It's not about predicting, it's about understanding the possibilities. And this is incredibly important for a couple of reasons. And that is that futures thinking is about shifting your perspective. Most people are really, really good about knowing everything about their area of expertise. Particularly if you think about tourism and hospitality, and you think about people like the folks at Disney that I worked with for 20 years, we could tell you for sure what the next thing was going to be in tourism, or at least what we thought it was going to be. We knew what was cutting edge. We knew what was out there that other people weren't doing. What we were less likely to know about were the things that didn't have anything to do with our subject matter area, that were actually going to be the things that were going to totally disrupt who we were. Things like, oh, I don't know, the internet and everybody going online to learn about things. I was at Disney when that conversation started happening, and suddenly we realized that we had to think about creating attractions that existed in real time in a physical space, but also could exist in asynchronous space online for people to engage with when they wanted to. That was a fascinating kind of conversation. Those are the kinds of conversations that we want to create. And what we try to do is we change people's perspective by, instead of thinking about today and how we will get to the future, by jumping into the future, imagining what might be possible, and then working backwards, thinking about how we would actually be able to create that future or how that future might come about. And by doing that, we discover opportunities much sooner than other people do. We don't wait for the future to show up. Equally important is we're able to anticipate disruption. Things like, oh, I don't know, pandemics that lock everybody down for 2 years. So those are the kinds of conversations that futurists have. What would happen if X were to actually occur? And finally, we get to shape our preferred future. And I'm going to talk a lot about preferred futures, and because that's the work you're doing in this project, is shaping preferred futures, I believe. Finally, I will just say this, because it's sort of my soapbox, I guess. And if you look around you today, even the most innovative people in the industry are usually trying to solve today's immediate problem. And 9 times out of 10, they're using yesterday's technology or yesterday's tools. As a futurist, we want to flip that on its head. We want to be preparing for tomorrow's problems and opportunities, and we want to be anticipating what tools there'll be that we can actually use when that happens. All of that comes down to a really simple thing. Futurist job is to imagine possible tomorrows, and then work with people to help them understand how they might actually create those tomorrows, make them possible, or what they need to know about them before they actually get here. And the most important thing for you to take from today is this: the future does not exist. It's not waiting for us to show up. The future is going to be created by someone. It's going to be created by our decisions or our lack of decisions. And so as people, particularly those who are going to create the future of hospitality and tourism in Central Florida, you have a huge voice in deciding what that future may actually look like. And what I wanted you to do is to raise it loudly and really use it as we think through this project and the things that you're going to be doing with it. Now that's all very, high level and flown and abstract feeling, but futurists do have a very specific work process that they go through. It isn't just science fiction, and that's the key element that you need to remember, is there is a way that we come up with these new ideas. We start by investigating what our values are. We need to know what is important. We need to know what we want to continue to do, and we need to know what we want to change in the future before we can even begin to think about the future. The second step is research. If you love research, you'll be a great futurist. We spend an enormous amount of our time digging into all sorts of obscure journals and trend reports and trying to find out little bits and pieces of what we think might indicate things that are going to happen in the future. So there's a lot of detective work involved in futures work. From all of that research, we create scenarios. Scenarios are nothing more than stories, examples of what the future might look like that we want to explore. And we try to examine as many possible scenarios as we can, because once again, the future doesn't exist. We want to be aware of all of the different possibilities. Then many times, and specifically for the work that you guys are doing, the next step is to create a preferred future. And a preferred future does not necessarily mean a perfect future. What it means is given all of the tools that we have, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in and the circumstances that we sort of project going forward, what's the best case future that we can create? What's the future that will best realize all of those values that we started out from? And that's the visioning piece. And that's what all of you are actually doing. You're helping to contribute to that vision piece, which I think is critically important. Finally, once you've done that, we then share that information typically with a client, with an organization that we're working with, and we help them build strategies so that they can begin to make that preferred future possible. So it's not strategic planning. It is something completely different from it, but it is an essential part of being able to create a strategic plan going forward. Fortunately for you guys, you won't have to do that part for this exercise because the truth is that's the really hard part. We'll hand that off to Jeff and the other folks at the county and Alan and let them figure out how to make these preferred futures actually happen for all of us. And I have great faith in them. So that's the process that we're actually going to talk about. What I want to do now is take you through the steps of that process, and particularly starting with the research place. Whoops. Well, hello. And the key is, if you're going to think about the future, it's a search. You're looking for clues, because if it doesn't exist yet, then you can't point at something and go, oh, look, over there, they're doing X, Y, and Z, and everybody's already doing it. You're looking for the minor things, some of the things that Alan shared with you last time in his introduction, things like the fact that some of the major airlines are starting to think about using renewable energy sources to move forward. Some of the work that's being done at the local level around things like autonomous vehicles and stuff like that. And you're looking for all of those different kinds of clues that you're looking for. The important thing in terms of the clue search is to remember that you can't just focus on one thing. You can't just search the future of tourism and hospitality and architecture, for instance. You can't just search the future of technology. The future is truly about the bringing together of a bunch of diverse and different things that surprise us in the ways that they actually come about. Take, for instance, social media today. That what is happening in the world, the way that it determines so much of what we do, is in part driven by technology, but it's also driven by all sorts of other things, driven by a generation that is more interested in telling their stories than listening to other people's stories, driven by businesses that are looking for different ways to actually attract people, do different forms of marketing. So there are lots of different things. Altogether, when we're trying to scan the future, what we do is something called environmental scanning. And environmental scanning is a systematic exploration. And it's also about picking up that magazine or that website that in a million years you would never imagine that you would look at. So if all you're doing is you know everything there is about all the upcoming trends in tourism and hospitality, and you've got a great sort of set of keywords, and you go out and you research them and you consider yourself an expert in that area, add something else to the work that you do. Once a month, go online and find something that seems to have absolutely nothing to do with your particular subject area. And over time, you'll find that you'll pick up little interesting bits and pieces that will combine to give you new and different ways of thinking about your own subject area. But specifically, we're going to look at 5 things. We're going to look at society trends, trends in technology, trends in economics, trends in the environment, and trends in politics. Now, if we were doing a deep dive into the future of tourism and hospitality for Central Florida, we would look at literally hundreds of examples for each of those different areas. Obviously, we don't have time for that today. So what I'm going to do is take you through and give you a couple of examples that fit into each bucket. And one of the things that we're going to share with you at the end is a brief list of resources where you can actually go much deeper. So if there's some area that you find interesting, you can go online, you can find a lot more information about it. So as you begin to build your project out, you can bring some really interesting new research that maybe none of us have seen. So we'd love to see that if you could do that. So society, the first one, how we live together, who we are, what our culture actually looks like. A couple of things. Number one is we are getting older. Even Alan is getting older, actually, I noticed. By 2050, a quarter of Florida's population will be over 65. Now, I know many of us believe that most of the people who live in Florida are already ancient, but the reality is that it's really only about 15% today. And nationwide, worldwide, that 20% figure is going to be closer than it is anywhere else. And that has huge implications. It has implications in terms of the kind of infrastructure that we're going to need. It has a huge implication in terms of employment, what services are going to need to be provided. And certainly when you bring it down to tourism, there has huge implications in terms of how we think about tourism. One of the projects that I was working on back when I was at Disney was really thinking about how different someone who is 65, 75, or 85 sees the world because of their different physical capabilities, and how we really had to start rethinking about how we design physical spaces, not only closed captioning on the films, but even how people could see, particularly at nighttime as they were walking through the park. So it's going to have a huge impact about everything that we do there. Second important one in terms of society is the emergence of what I would call the climate conscious generation. We have been talking about the climate problem, some of us, for 20, 30 years now. Yet, until recently, it has been something that most people have tried to put out of mind, to say there's something for the future, something they're not particularly important to them. The last couple of years, we have seen a huge shift in that mentality. Today, 75% of the consumers expect businesses to acknowledge their impact on the environment and expect them to be doing something positive. Jared's presentation last week is a perfect example of what a cutting edge business is doing, and an example of why we think this trend is so very important. A couple of things to keep in mind. Even though most of us say that we want an environmentally sustainable future, when it comes to buying products and services, we don't always act with the same kinds of commitment that our words have. Part of the challenge there is because of the cost factors that have been involved. Part of it is about creating a system that makes it much easier for us to negotiate and make it possible to make those better environmental decisions. But consumers in general are going to continue to think about those things. So let's move on now and just talk a little bit about technology, which, if you spend any time thinking about the future, you'll find that most people spend most of their time here. And there are two reasons. One of them is it's easy to see technology. It's a bright, shiny thing. And you can show it to people and you can say it's going to be good or bad and you can get them excited about it. But there's another more relevant reason. And that is, for all of you, your future is a digital age. Now, you've heard that term and people have been talking about that for a long time, but the reality is that something that started on March 9th, 1957, in a small corner of a conference room in Cleveland, Ohio, a couple of guys with a sort of ragtag presentation of something they called an integrated computer chip, has turned into the driving force about economics, about society, about culture. Just like we used to live in the industrial age, and before that we lived in the age of print, you are now going to continue to live in the age of digital. And it is going to have a huge ramification about everything that we do, outsized in terms of what we're talking about. Just a couple of examples here. Every one of us is carrying around a computer that is literally tens of thousands of times more powerful than the computers that were used to land the first humans on the moon. The fact that we still call this a phone is an indication of how difficult it is for us to think about the future. It's not a phone. It just happens to do that, along with all the other things that it actually does. And the other thing to think about, to get a sense of context of how important this technology is, the first really popular smartphone, the Apple iPhone, is literally 13 years old. And we're close to 100% smartphone penetration, at least in this country. There's something like 4 billion smartphones in the entire world. Think about how fast that changes. Think about what that might mean for other technology like that in the future as you begin to think about the impact technology is going to have. That tool, that idea is really going to be an important part of what we're doing. And it leads to things like this. The fact that not only are we connected by our computers and able to have classroom in the middle of a COVID pandemic, but increasingly our devices themselves are connected. I'm guessing many of you have an Alexa or whatever the Google device is, or one of those other things that, spends way too much time listening to you in your home and telling you, what the weather is. But just once again, think about how quickly they've invaded. In 2020, we think there are about 35 billion connected devices, everything from the Alexa to your refrigerator, to your autonomous vehicle, to your toaster even. By 2030, the latest predictions are 75 billion devices will be connected. By 2050, who knows? Everything, including us, if we're using Elon Musk Neuralink, right? And the idea is that every time these predictions come out, they go up. It's growing even faster. So what does that really mean? It means a number of things. It's the reason we have personalization today. It's the reason Amazon knows what you really want even before you know it. It's actually very powerful for doing things like making cities more environmentally efficient, controlling traffic in real time, creating what we call smart cities. But of course, there's some dark sides to that as well. It makes it possible for us to know everything about you. Surveillance is a huge issue that we're going to have to grapple with as we understand how do we balance the ability, the advantage of personalization with the ability of people to snoop. And then, of course, the other real threat is the question of what is the possibility of hacking these systems. And we've seen that. I don't know if all of you saw it just this week. Somebody tried to hack a water system here in Florida and was trying to pollute the water there and put poison and create a poisonous water situation through the internet. So there's a lot of really interesting challenges around this and ones that we really need to be aware of. Next, in terms of technology, are our artificial partners. Now today, worldwide, there are about as many robots, about 2 million, as there are people in Orlando, in the Central Florida area. So, you know, the world hasn't been taken over yet. But in the future, we're going to see a huge exponential increase in these artificial partners, particularly in a couple of areas. Number one, in areas like dealing with all of those older people and providing healthcare for them. We're already seeing trends that suggest robots are going to be a big part of that. But more relevant to all of you, one of the things the pandemic is doing, and after the pandemic, the movement for things like a $15 minimum wage, which is a great idea, but will have all sorts of impacts on people, is we're going to see more and more automation in those businesses that are, you know, dealing with consumers, particularly things like hospitality, things like tourism, where we're going to see more and more robots and even artificial intelligence, which is just really smart computers, that are going to be taking over more and more of those jobs. So as you think about that future, think about how those artificial partners can be used to our advantage and not necessarily just to eliminate jobs. Finally, the last one I want to talk about very quickly is mixed reality. Once again, we've talked about virtual reality for 30 years now. We've all seen the Matrix. We've all been waiting for it. It will be here in 2032 when Apple releases their mixed reality glasses, because Apple has the ability to be the last guy to show up in the market and to suddenly own the market overnight. So in the next 10 years, we're going to see huge uses of mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, particularly in places like education and in entertainment. They're going to be really big new elements. They're going to do things like compete with theme parks, not just be integrated into the theme parks. And so we start to think about what does that actually mean in terms of how we explore these areas. Next, I want to talk a little bit about economics. And of course, economics, at the end of the day, even for a creative guy like me who'd rather tell stories, is sort of the foundation that has a huge impact on where the future will actually result. Because if we can't make it work economically, then there's a good chance that it probably won't be a future that we create. There are a couple of things, though, that I think are really important in terms of thinking about how the shift may make 2050 and what tourism looks like in 2050 completely different. The first one is this idea of we're moving from being consumers to being creators. I don't know if any of you have a 3D printer, if you've had to play with, if you had a chance to play with one, but they're fascinating technology, about the size of your computer printer. Most of the ones you can buy for your home office today, you know, make little tchotchkes out of plastic. But there are 3D printers out there that will print an entire house in 24 hours. There are 3D printers that NASA is looking at to use for printing food in outer space. There are 3D printers that the medical profession is looking at for printing organs and skin and bones and things like that. What's most fascinating about this technology is the way it's being adapted. It is, much of the work is open source. So for instance, there have been numerous examples of where people, say in Australia, have read online that some kid in Africa needed a new prosthetic, a new arm, because they'd lost it for some reason. That group gets together, gets the plans for free online for creating prosthetics, makes the device for them, and then sends it to them. When the pandemic broke out, most of the 3D printing in the makers, the people who were doing that kind of stuff, immediately started producing personal protection equipment. And in less than a month, they produced something like 23 million pieces of personal protection equipment at a time when nobody could buy that stuff, and started giving it away. That's a different economics. That's a different kind of economy. And the other part you see in the world of media, where increasingly the biggest media stars are actually sometimes teenagers in their bedrooms. We are controlling what is actually being created in the future. This expands to thinking about completely new economic models. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about economics because it is a rabbit hole. But one of the things that you need to take from this when you think about the future is our current vision of how the economy works, which ultimately means how business works, is not manna from heaven. It's not mandated. It's something that we as a human society decided we wanted to create. And so there are lots of people that are exploring new economic models. The one I would recommend you look into is something called the donut economy. It's best explained by Kate Raworth, who wrote the original book about it. But the basic idea is, what if we shifted the way we thought about economics from gross national product to gross happiness or gross healthiness? What would that change? What would it mean if we had a sort of a donut where we thought about making sure that all of our economic decisions actually related to promoting people, profit, and planet? And a lot of what Jared talked about last week is a great example of how this trend is playing out. Things like the B business move, the benefit business movement, the conscious capitalism, great examples that we're beginning to think about different ways to think about the future. Next comes the environment, an incredibly important part of our future, particularly here in Florida, one that we, I think, tend to be a little too optimistic about. So I'm going to be kind of Debbie Downer for a minute. In the last 20 years, all of the trends have indicated that we are moving into a time of what is best described as climate chaos. Flooding has increased, extreme weather has increased by significant amounts. In the last 4 of the 5 hottest years on record have happened in the last 4 years. So we realize it's particularly important in terms of thinking about Florida. And here are some predictions for the year 2050. And the important thing to understand is, no matter what we do today, some level of having to acknowledge and deal with a climate that is not going to be as friendly as today's climate is part of Florida's future. In terms of dangerous heat days, this is for Miami, they're thinking there will be 151. I've seen similar statistics that suggest here in Central Florida, we might be over 100 a day, which is a 4-fold increase. I don't know about you, but I've stood in line at Disney before in August. I'm not sure I want to do that when it's over 100 degrees. Flooding, rising sea level is something we're also going to have to deal with. The particular prediction here is the worst possible case scenario. So hopefully we will not have lost all of South Florida by 2050. But at the same time, the scientists continue every year to suggest that the impacts are going to be greater than they were expecting in previous studies. So there's real serious issues there. And another one that we don't talk about at all here, but is critical for us in Central Florida, is the question of, will we have enough clean drinking water by 2050? Not only for all of us, but how about all those tourists that we want to keep coming here? So there's some really important environmental issues that we have to acknowledge, and we have to say they're going to be a part of our future. Finally, politics. This is a great conversation, which we won't go down too deep into. In terms of thinking about the future, futurists step out of today's crazy yelling, screaming at each other, and want to look at what it means 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And the trend that we're seeing is something we call global, global and local combined at the same time. Increasingly, where you live does not matter, because we have access to more and more high-speed internet everywhere. And so people are more and more interested in creating local communities that actually work for them, that are based on their needs, where they're finding other people that they want to be with, where they're going to build a much more exciting local communities. And in fact, really interesting thing for all of you, Orlando in the last 5 years has become one of the leading examples of how you become a much stronger community. Now, part of that has to do with the people who are in positions of power and who are making decisions. Part of it has to do with the people at the university as well. who made a real commitment to thinking about how do we experiment differently at the local level? How do we create a vibrant community, one where people don't want to come, go to college and then leave, which is what used to happen in Orlando, but where we're seeing more and more people choose this as a place that they actually want to live. What that means is we will see more experimentation because local communities can try things radically different. Amsterdam and Brussels are two cities that are actually going to use the donut economy over the next couple of years. Central Florida is a great example in terms of what we've been doing in terms of embracing solar energy and trying to use that and see how we can make that spread. So there's a great opportunity there in terms of what might be happening. Wow, that was probably a fire hose of things. And like I said, that was just to kind of give you a taste, a little just sort of high level idea of what futurists do and where we kind of live as we go through all of this stuff. As I said, the resources will give you some examples of where you can actually dig deeper and really begin to understand some of those. Hopefully what you get from today is some sense of how that might relate to the project that you're working on. So that's what I want to do for this last part. I want to take you a little bit deeper and talk about what do we then do with all of this information. And as I said in the beginning, excuse me, as I said in the beginning, thinking about the future is about thinking about lots of different things. You can't just focus on one particular thing. And so what we want to try and do is mix different examples of those different trends together that we've analyzed and begin to think about what scenarios might exist for the future and how we might actually begin to think about creating things that would help us understand the possibilities and the opportunities that might exist. I'm going to share 3 examples with you today and talk a little bit about how we come up with examples like this. Scenario number 1 is the one I'm calling solar punk. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. It's an emerging sort of genre in art and science fiction. This would be what we would call a utopian scenario of the future. Everything goes right and we get a perfect world. The elements of a future like this, particularly with what we're talking about for Central Florida, is a huge focus on fighting climate change. That would be one of our major efforts from a political and economic point of view. The scenario also would have to assume that we get lucky, that those worst case scenarios and projections for what might happen with the climate don't come true. And then we have some amazing technological breakthroughs that help us mitigate some of those impacts. It's also a scenario that suggests that we have extreme decentralization. That what happens is we have more and more local communities who become tightly bonded internally and are able to create more and more interesting experimentation. Everything from new forms of currency to barter systems to new ways of thinking about how you create, say, universal income for people. Those are the kinds of things that a solar punk scenario might envision. That rise of the alternative economies, business whose main purpose is to actually contribute to making the environment a better place would be the fastest growing environments in this sort of scenario. And finally, in the solar punk scenario, there is the assumption that we focused on our big equity and equality issues and that we've made real progress toward them. Now, you can find trends to support all of these things, and you can create this kind of scenario that's relatively reasonable. It's not the only one, and you never want to stop with one. The alternative is the collapse scenario. And this is what we call the dystopian future, right? In this one, we have the worst case climate chaos. Things really get as bad as some of the predictions. We'd probably suffer from an increase in cyber hacks and surveillance, and technology is not our friend. Governments start to really struggle. One of the things that people are not talking a lot about right now is the impact of COVID over the last year. The economic impact has had a huge deleterious impact on local governments. Places like Orlando and Central Florida are suffering from huge losses in sales tax and stuff like that. If we can't reverse that trend, that's going to be a serious issue. And all of that ultimately will lead to more economic inequality. That's a completely different future. In that future, you're probably going to think about tourism completely differently if that's the scenario you use to think about 2050. Now, you could pick either of these 2 scenarios. Unfortunately, neither of them is exactly the way the future tends to turn out. The future tends to be a little more complicated. And so what we want to do, I think, is suggest a 3rd scenario, and that's the balance scenario. And the balance scenario describes something that I call a practopia. Actually, I didn't invent the word. It came from Heidi and Alvin Toffler. And it's a better future. It's not perfect, but it's aspirational and it's also achievable. And as you think about the future that you're setting your story in 2050 in, I would suggest that you want it to feel like a practopia. You want to feel like you're pushing the boundaries. You want to feel like it's positive, but you also want to be able to straight face tell people, yeah, I think we can achieve all of the great things we're talking about. For our particular purposes for this scenario, in that sort of practopia, ecotech would have a huge impact. The fact that we're starting to see huge increases in the use of things like solar and wind energy would just continue, and those advances would be even more important. We would probably see some economic initiatives like the Green New Deal and that sort of movement to create more jobs in that area. Community collaboration is a key part of practopia. How do we begin to take everyone in the community and give them a voice in creating the world that we're actually creating in the future? Talked about economic experimentation already. The practopia scenario envisions a world where everyone's a benefit corporation, where everybody does what Jared really wants everybody to become, right? People who are really super concerned about using business not just for profit, but actually to regenerate the world that we live in, to create regenerative tourism that actually makes the world, the community better than it was before. And finally, there's the question of just business for good across the board. All of these things in the practopian thing tie back to what Jared and Jeff talked about last week, and that was the values. And that was what they sort of set up for us, right? Remember, Jeff said that the future, the Vision 2050's goal was to create a community of tomorrow that benefited everyone. And Jared talked about creating a tourism industry that would be regenerative, not just sustainable, but would actually contribute to making the community better places to meet, better places to visit, and better places to visit. So as you look at the trends that I presented today, what I hope that you will do is begin to think about how you can imagine a practopian future for 2050 and use that as the setting for the specific business or idea or strategy that you're going to create going forward. And finally, I've got a couple of things I just want to share with you very quickly. As we think about Visit Florida 2050, what it might look like and how we might begin to tell those stories. And this comes from a project I worked with a great local designer back in November on. And we weren't looking at Central Florida. We were thinking about the future of tourism in Florida in general. And what would happen, particularly if the climate chaos was as bad as some people might think about it. And this is just an example of how you might tell your story. So here are 3 postcards from the future. The first one, of course, is sort of that extreme idea is that if we lose Miami completely, some enterprising business person will figure out how to have snorkel Miami, that we can actually go investigate those. A second one, it's a lot of money that's already been spent building all of those incredible businesses in Miami Beach. Maybe we turn it into the new Venice. And for anybody who's interested in this, there's a great Stanley Kim Robinson science fiction book called New York 2042, which really is this sort of scenario for the future. It's a crazy idea, but part of what we want to encourage you to do is to think big, think outside the box. And then finally, there's this idea, the idea of the future tourism comes to you. You don't actually have to go to it. You know, once again, these are high level technology futures. Yours doesn't have to have a lot of technology in it. But what I want to encourage you to do is to think how you might actually create it in a way that's really compelling, a really exciting, wonderful story that we want to do. Finally, to wrap on things up, I just want to go back to Walt for a minute. And this, of course, is a statement that I suspect many of you have seen before. And the key to this statement is many people think about the doing piece. They think about, oh yeah, we can do it if, that's the key. And that's important. But before you can do it, you have to dream it. You have to be able to imagine the possibilities. And that's really what thinking like a futurist is all about. The ability to imagine the possibilities. The role that you guys are playing is so incredibly important in terms of thinking about a vision for the future of Central Florida. You're the Imagineers. You're the people who are going to take your expertise, your knowledge, and add it with your imagination. And you're going to inspire a whole bunch of people who are largely in the business of creating strategies and tactics. And without your vision, they will probably not be able to create something that is nearly as exciting for the future. That's what I'm hoping for. That's why I am really honored that you guys have listened to me blather on here for the last 45 minutes. I think we may have some time for some conversation if you guys would like to do that. So I will let you look at me instead of Walt, although he's probably better looking. But thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Joe. That was wonderful. Snorkel Miami. That's not something I've thought of. Oh, we've got a spontaneous Zoomer for Joe there. That was wonderful. Yeah. Joe, can I just ask you one question, then open up to the students, who I'm sure we'll have some questions. Joe, everything you said was wonderful. You must have come across many people on certainly your Disney career. Oh, we've tried that before. That doesn't work. Oh no, that never worked. You know, the traditional naysayers. How do you cope with the, oh, we've done that before and it failed mentality? Because we're trying to instill in the students a positivity, anything is possible. So how do you cope with like the negative Nells, as I call them?
Oh my goodness, yeah, those are they're always a tough group to deal with. One of the things I like to do is point out those examples where we've seen such radical change. Look at what you guys have done in the course of a few months when it looked like the old way of having education wasn't going to work anymore. You found a new way of doing it, right? And it wasn't that we hadn't talked about this before. We've been talking about remote meetings for what, a decade now. So there are plenty of examples, I think, in order to do that. The second thing is you really have to work to make sure the people you surround yourself with are people who are interested in finding answers and solutions. When I worked at Disney, I worked a lot with a group. We did a lot of interactive stuff. We had a great engineer that we worked with. And I remember I would go to him and I would show him these crazy ideas, right? And he would look at me and he'd go, "That's great, Joe. It just violates all the laws of physics." To which I would always say, "Well, that's good. You know, is that a felony, misdemeanor? What are we talking about here?" You know, and then he'd go, "Leave me alone. I'll be back in a couple of days." And he would come back and he'd go, "You can't do that, but you can do this." And that's what you need to engender with the teams that you work with. The key to Imagineering is something called blue sky thinking. You shoot for the moon, you think that anything is possible because you know at the end of the day, you'll get much further out there. And so that's a practice, Alan, more than anything else. And it can be frustrating sometimes.
Lovely. Thank you. Students or Dr. Baker, Giselle, Jared, if you're listening, any questions for Joe? I thoroughly enjoyed that. I thought that was excellent. It's given me some positive vibes for this afternoon, Joe.
Well, hopefully it is more positive than anything else. And I really do encourage you guys to check out some of the resources. There's a ton of really great information out there that you can bring back to this project and really surprise all of us.
I have a question for you. So, especially with thinking of the dystopian future that you showed, how do you keep yourself from getting dragged down by the negativity and the doom and gloom of it? How do you look for a positive future when sometimes the odds don't look like that's going to happen?
Your generation particularly has a huge burden on you because that's all you hear anymore are dystopian futures. And I understand that completely. And there are a couple of things. One is the future. If you look at history, the future is never as good or as bad as we imagine it. It's always messy, right? And the other thing is you could think about those parts of the future that you have impact on. You couldn't control whether or not we had a COVID pandemic, totally beyond your capability, right? But as a community, we can certainly control how we react to those situations. And some communities have done better than others. So a lot of it for me is don't get so hung up in, oh, the whole world and the future, but think about your localized future and what you're going to do. And then the other thing, and this is somewhat what I tell people is you have to be critically optimistic because you don't make change if you're not optimistic. And at the same time, you have to understand that, yeah, it's not perfect. There are a lot of things we got to deal with. If we don't address the climate issue, particularly here in Florida, we will have a dystopian future. To me, that's one of the few things I will predict. So I don't know if that helps or not. That may just scare you more. But the other thing is this idea is if you want to change the future, you start by changing the stories that you tell about the future. And we'll get overshoot. We'll do some things wrong, but that's better than just giving up and living in this kind of dystopian world that science fiction creates for us right now. So anyway, sorry, you got me on my soapbox. I'm passionate that we have to get up every morning and convince ourselves to be optimistic.
My recommendation, Danielle, avoid the TV news as well. Life's a lot better if you avoid TV news.
And social media and you know, it's
Yeah. Somebody else got time for a couple more questions, 2 more questions. Anybody want to dive in? Our students are not normally this quiet. Carissa, is there anything that you want to ask Joe? But bearing in mind that he set a very high bar for us next week, which I'm very nervous about.
Yeah, I was gonna say, no kidding. That was amazing. And I also have to say your voice is so calming that I want to hear your futures just because your voice is so calming. So I guess my question is, especially thinking about the student projects going forward, how much of it is based on research, and then how much of it is that you part?
I would say for a project like this, it's probably 50-50, maybe 60% research. As I said before, the key to creating a story about the future, an inspiring vision about the future is it has to be inspiring. You know, you have to want us to do it, but you also have to be able to sit down with somebody who's going to challenge you, like Danielle asked, those naysayers, and you have to say, this is why I think this is possible. You know, so it doesn't have to be absolute. It just has to be possible. And that's where the creativity piece comes in. And like I said, that's why I'm so excited to be able to see what you guys come up with. Because I think what's missing in so much of our conversation right now is that creativity piece. You know, that ability to imagine that the world could be radically different in 30 years. You know, I remember 1982 when Epcot's big, giant, massive, overscaled buildings was the future, right? And that's not the future we talk about anymore at all. So hopefully that helps. But I'm looking forward to, you know, let your creativity go wild. I think that's what we need more than anything else from this group, because the folks who are going to be, you know, looking at what you do are going to be, once again, strategy people and tacticians, and they're going to be the ones that go, oh, it's going to cost too much, you know. So.
Lovely. Thank you, Carissa. Anybody else for a final question to Joe? Hopefully he certainly inspired me. Okay, Joe, thank you. Oh, Po-Yang, yes, fire away for our last question. Thank you very much.
I have a question. So how do you tell like the difference between something like that's like more like fantasy and more practical, like a real future or a fantasy?
Well, that's why one of the things we do is this environmental scanning idea. What we're really looking for are sort of little bits and pieces that suggest that somebody's already started to do something. For instance, you know, Elon Musk and the neural link, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's an interesting example. You know, he's claiming that within the next 5 years, he's going to have a computer chip that he can plant into your brain. Now, that was fantasy 5 years ago. But the fact that he's actually working on it, that he's actually trying to develop it and has the resources, and he's not just, you know, completely crazy, indicates that that might actually then become a real future. So you want some evidence to back up anything that you're thinking about. You know, donut economics, another great idea, which I really, if you don't know anything about it, it's worth learning more about. The fact that Amsterdam and Brussels are going to try to institute a completely new approach to how we think about economics, that means that that's not a fantasy anymore. So that's what you're looking for. You need to have a few examples.
Actually, Joe, just picking up on what Po-Yang said there, and a final question, does it help, if you're a futurist, does it help to be a little bit crazy?
No, it helps to be a lot crazy. That's not a leading question. No, it helps to be a lot crazy. Now, I will say this, and it's why I sort of...
I know Joe well enough to ask him that.
Yeah. I mean, it's why I set up the presentation the way I did. What I realized, because I was an Imagineer first, and I was a storyteller first, and I actually went to something called the World Future Society Conference back in 1999. And what immediately became obvious to me was that there were all these people, very smart people, most of them academic background, who were doing all this research, but none of them knew how to tell a story. And so I think that the real key element of a futurist is to be in a man. And now I looked around, I said, this is what I've been doing. I get this. And it was like you sort of fall into the, oh yeah, that's what we're doing. So I think, yes, crazy. Yes, knowing a little bit about a lot of things. You don't have to be an expert at anything. That's the other thing I tell people. But being a storyteller, because storytelling is that's how you understand how the future evolves. So. And I'm going to remember you called me crazy, Alan. Just so you know.
Lovely. Okay, it's coming up for 1:58, guys. Thank you very much indeed, Joe. Can we have a round of applause for Joe? Marvelous session.
Thank you, guys, and I so look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. I think it's going to be
Joe
great.
will be one of the judges, so excellent. And everybody, you'll get this video link or the Zoom link from my colleague Arion tomorrow, and then next week you will see myself and my colleague Dr. Chrissa Baker for workshop 3. So we're rolling. We've got momentum here. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you, Joe. Wonderful.